So we're going to hear a talk by Dan Levin this morning of Vanderbilt University. This is one of two plenary sessions sponsored by a grant of the Templeton Religion Trust entitled Character Engagement and Moral Understanding in Screen Stories. The grantees are all present at this conference. Allison Eden, Murray Smith, myself, and of course Dan Levin. And there will be 3 or 4 other talks by various people who are involved with the grant, and I'm not going to name them all here. But we have, the talk today will be 45 minutes for the presentation and 15 minutes for the discussion. And as you can see the title, I'm not going to read it for you, but let me introduce to you Dan Levin of Vanderbilt University with his talk, which I'm very much looking forward to. So Dan.
All right, thank you very much. I am going to start today by encouraging you to actively participate in this talk because this is going to be about surprises. And in order to be surprised, you have to commit a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of hand out pieces of paper. I want everyone to have one piece of paper, and I'm going to hand out some pencils in case you don't have a pencil. I realize that might be a problem. And I'm going to ask you to commit to some predictions for what's going to happen in the experiments I tell you about before I tell you about them. We're going to commit, we're going to vote, we're going to trade papers, the kind of thing I do in class sometimes to really get people to commit. Okay, so here we go. So take one piece of paper and a pencil if you don't have it. So maybe hand these out. Pencils. This is going to be super low tech. While we're doing this, I just want to acknowledge a lot of the people who came before me establishing this really important idea that we can do a science of cinema, that we can do a science on an art that most likely, in a lot of ways, developed or evolved iteratively to integrate with our perceptual and cognitive skills. And of course, a lot of people have argued that, but one of the main people that argued that is right over there, James Cutting, who's been spending a long time really focusing on understanding the structure of perception and cognition and how it reflects, goes along with, and guided the evolution of cinema. And so with that in mind, I want to start talking about the big idea that we're going to be looking at a little bit is moral understanding. And for me, moral understanding is a new topic. I really feel like I'm out over my skis a little bit here. Because our lab has not done a lot of research on this. We've done work on attention and perception, and maybe some of the concepts that guide attention and perception. And so one of the things that makes this venture a little bit unnerving for me, a little bit scary, is sort of the big gap between visual or cognitive experiences and how those experiences change the way you think. And so we're going to try to navigate that gap a little bit, and I'm going to look at one way of making that link between upfront experience, especially experience of an art form like cinema, and moral understanding or generally thinking. And the path I'm going to chart sort of goes from these experiences we have during cinema to cinematic continuity, those first forms of cognitive and perceptual integration that starts to give those experiences meaning. And then I'm going to try to make a link from that to the idea of reflection, of thinking deeply about that meaning, and ultimately to moral understanding. And so there's a lot of ways of making these links. There's a million processes that are not illustrated here. We're just taking one very thin line going from A to D. And like I said, lots of other ways to do that. So how do you do that? Let's start by trying to define one of these mediating processes, and that's cinematic continuity. That first moment when those experiences start to get put together. A lot of people have really tried to define this idea of cinematic continuity, and this is just kind of a cadged together set of different definitions that come from a lot of different sources. The idea of cinematic continuity is that when you're trying to combine cinematic elements, and it's usually shots, but it can be other things as well, into integrated sequences, what you want to do is, number one, avoid some things. You want to avoid this jerk or this perceptual moment when your attention is attracted to a discontinuity. You also want to create the illusion of continuous action from all those shots. You want to support the idea of a continuous narrative. And you want to preserve graphic, space, time, logical, narrative connections between shots. So one of the first ways of thinking about this in terms of psychological science is we're talking about perceptual and cognitive processes. There's some perceptual aspects of continuity and some cognitive aspects of continuity. And to define that just a little more, let's think about what perception and cognition really kind of is. Perception is a set of processes that typically involve the first forms of information extraction that our brain does with visual information, auditory information. It's usually pretty fast. It usually occurs before awareness, so perceptual processes are often outside of awareness. And they're often capacity for your high capacity. Our perceptual systems can process lots of information in parallel. Another really important feature of many perceptual processes is that they tend to occur by default. So when information comes into your brain, those processes tend to happen irrespective of your specific goals. It's like basic automatic default processing. And this is a very broad summary characterization of these two different processes. Versus cognition, which is slower. It doesn't go as fast. It's conscious. It's usually associated with awareness, especially cognitive processes. It's capacity limited. We can only be aware of a few things. We can only do this deep processing of a small proportion of the information that comes into our sense systems. Another really important piece of it is it's functional. I'm using functional in a very limited sense here, in that usually we only think about the things that are related to our goals. Right? We don't think about things that we don't have a goal for. If we have a purpose for thinking about something, that's when we think about it. So that's what I mean by functional in this case. And so what I'm going to do is talk about a series of phenomena that help us understand both perceptual and conceptual continuity, I think in ways that might actually make some connections between the experience of cinema and changing the way we think, or moral understanding, bridging this big gap. So let's start with the perceptual part. The first form of continuity I want to talk about is a basic form of perceptual continuity that's implicated in something called match action editing. And I think this will, can we click the clicker to play this? It should loop. So what we're looking at is something called a match action edit. And this may reflect the most simple form of perceptual continuity, where a motion that begins in one shot continues in the next shot, and the last frame of the outgoing shot matches the state of progress in the first frame of the incoming shot. And so this is a shot from an edit from the movie Drugstore Cowboy, in which you can see pretty darn clearly that the editor has taken some pretty substantial care to match the exact state of progress in how Matt Damon is swinging that thing, although you can see there are other sort of things that don't totally match. And so the question is, how does this perceptual form of continuity work? Well, there's a really interesting study came out a while ago that suggested something really interesting about this form of continuity. It was a study done by Art Shimomura, and the reference was there. It's there when you go backwards. It's not there when you go forwards. Okay, that is a translation error that happened going from a Mac to a PC. So this is an old experiment by Art Shimomura, which suggested something really interesting about this form of perceptual continuity. It was that when you're making an edit that continues an action, that the smoothest, best edit overlaps that action just a little bit. So the last frame of the outgoing shot should overlap with the first frame of the incoming shot by about 3 frames. Here's the results that Shimomura got that plot that out. So what we're looking at here is the results of an experiment in which subjects manipulated that little movie of someone drinking something, and you see one shot, they start the drinking action, the next shot, they continue the action. And this chart shows the amount of bias that participants pick. So 0 is an exact match. And you can see not very many participants picked 0 as the best edit. Instead, the majority of participants chose a 3 to 4 frame overlap as the best edit. And so that implies that maybe this basic form of perception requires a little bit of help at the edit. It requires a little bit of repetition of the motion so that your brain can catch up with the edit. Now, we were a little bit skeptical of that. I presented this to my students in my film and psychology class. And for a variety of reasons, we were skeptical of that. And one of the reasons was we had also read The Attentional Theory of Continuity by Tim Smith. And this is one of the foundational theories that can help us understand continuity. And we were thinking, attentional theory of continuity, well, if you really want to have the best continuity, you need to deliver attention to the correct location, and this will create the best sense of synchrony among all the subjects. It'll also get people to sort of be all looking at the same thing at the same time, achieving the goals of continuity. And why would an overlap deliver attention to the exact right place? It would deliver attention to the wrong place. But we thought maybe what was going on in this experiment that produced the overlap bias is, I'm going to skip this so we can go ahead here, is that there was an accidental graphic match that produced an attentional form of continuity with the 3-frame overlap. And Shimomura's movies weren't available, so we couldn't tell. So if you look at maybe the last frame of your outgoing shot, you got to think about the degree to which the first frame of the incoming shot lands at the exact same screen location for different amounts of overlap. So if we're looking at the last frame of this outgoing shot and our first frame of the incoming shot, I'm illustrating that little cup that that person was drinking from. 3-frame ellipsis, maybe the cup was a little forward, an exact match, maybe the cup was like right in the middle of her arm movement, and then a 3-frame overlap, the cup hadn't proceeded, or it had proceeded further. Right, do I have that backwards? Anyway, maybe what was going on is that there was an accidental graphic match between the 3-frame overlap and the outgoing frame of the previous shot, such that, according to the attentional theory of continuity, that accidental graphic match at a 3-frame overlap is the thing that made people prefer it and made attention land in the right place. And so my students and I were thinking, okay, let's make some movies that fix that accidental overlap and make sure that the graphic match between the outgoing shot and incoming shot at 0 frames is in the same screen location, so we deliver attention to the right place. And then we thought people would prefer the 0-frame match, that this overlap bias would go away and attentional theory of continuity would work really well here. And so here's the question. This is the experiment. Let me show you what we did. So we had participants view a couple videos, and you're going to need to make a prediction now. And they viewed the videos, and they rated how smooth or continuous the edit looked. And we showed them different amounts of ellipsis, exact match, or overlap. And so what is going to happen? You have to commit now. Okay, so this is, write down in your paper, empirical test number 1. What is going to happen in this experiment? We had a lot of expectations. So when the graphic relations favor an exact match, will the overlap bias persist? Is this something that characterizes a lot of different situations. Will there be a preference for an exact zero frame match now that we're making the graphic bias go away? Will that work? Or will there be a preference for an ellipsis? Some experiments actually have found that. Or none of the above. Okay, so write it down. You got to commit. No, not committing here. You got to predict it. You're going to run an experiment. That's the whole point of all this stuff. You got to come up with a prediction. Okay? And so write this down, vote. And the next thing I always do in my classes is I don't let people represent their own votes. I make people trade. And to get a little social interaction going here, you have to trade with someone. So trade your vote with someone. Find someone to trade with. If you're sitting all by yourself, just trade. And if you trade twice, trade again. You're not going to be representing your own vote here. So you're not going to be self-interested here. This will be objective and everything. And so let's get ready to vote. Trade with someone. You're going to be trading over and over again, so you're going to meet your neighbors here. Get ready to vote. Okay. So, and why, right? So who says, raise your hand, and this is if the paper you have says this. This isn't you. This is the vote you have. Okay, you got to represent. A, will the overlap bias persist? Raise your hand. Okay, we got a lot of people thinking the overlap bias persists. Thinks that even if the graphic, okay, B, preference for the exact match. Okay, okay, some people going to preference for the exact match. Preference for ellipsis. Okay, looks like we got a pretty even set of preferences here. None of the above. A few people say none of the above. Okay, and it turns out that those of you who said none of the above are right. This experiment was a big surprise. None of us predicted what happened, and what happened was there was no preference for any amount of overlap or mismatch. They were all the same. This was dead even. The first time the undergrads came to me with this data, I told them, you did it wrong. You screwed up. Go back and do it again. They did it again. It came back that way again. We repeated this over and over again with different ratings, with different movies. This is what you get. The rating for smoothness or a bunch of other things stays the same. There's no effect of match or mismatch going from plus 12 frames to minus 12 frames. This is 30 frames per second, so that's 400 milliseconds. For smoothness ratings, we did pacing judgments, we mismatch detection, we did jump detection. None of that mattered. It's all dead flat. And you can do Bayesian analyses and say, yeah, there is strong support for the null hypothesis here. Once you get up to about 1,000 milliseconds or whole seconds, then it starts mattering. Another thing that we noticed is that if you view the movie over and over again and you start pushing people, you start to get little preferences for an exact match. And that is the clue for why we got such different results from Shimomura, right? So with Shimomura, if you look at their method, they had participants scrutinize those edits. Participants watched them over and over again, and they changed the amount of overlap or ellipsis iteratively until they were satisfied with the edit. So in some sense, those participants were scrutinizing this edit versus our participants who just watched it. We told them, watch it, you're going to talk about the details of it. In that case, there's no preference for an overlap or a mismatch. So when you do judgment or detection of individual sequences, things look and feel very different. And one of the first messages here is, I'd argue that our method is more ecologically valid because this is what happens when you watch a movie. This is what film editors care about. Your experience when you're trying to understand the movie, not your ability to scrutinize different amounts of mismatch and overlap. So when we look at this, we start to get this interesting sense for how attention is functioning, especially as it mediates cognition and perception. So on one view, attention can really trigger this integrated cognitive processing, and in some cases it does, especially perceptual attention. And on some views, that triggering causes integration. So by virtue of the fact that you are merely paying attention to something, you integrate processing. But maybe that's not always the case. Maybe there are circumstances where When you pay attention, you have goals. That attention is driven by what you think. And in those cases, it's your goals that determine the perceptual information that gets integrated across the views, not an automatic process of integrating all the aspects of the information and matching it across views. So this idea that you have to have an exact match might stem from a view of attention where you pay attention. That mere act of attention gets you to integrate all this information, compare all the details, and then if they're off, you notice. Maybe we have a more cognitively driven form of attention that's more selective. And so what I'm talking about here is bottom-up and top-down attention. There's lots of different theories of attention that make this distinction. And so we've got a surprise. Maybe integrating match-action editing is more top-down attention than bottom-up automatic attention. Let's look at some other phenomena that support continuity and think about how different forms of attention might be relevant. So another phenomenon we studied a long time ago was change blindness. This is ancient history research. I'm very briefly going to tell you about it. It's research in which we asked about the degree to which continuity errors are noticed when your goals, again, are cognitively driven, as most movie viewers are. They are trying to understand the sequence. They're not trying to understand different properties. Okay, so when your goals are cognitively driven, when you're trying to understand the sequence, and there are changes between shots, for example, in this case, you get all these, back, there we go, sorry. When you're trying to understand a sequence between shots, things can change, right? This person's scarf disappears, and then the place changes, all this stuff. People tend not to see it unless they have a specific goal of focusing on that property. Sometimes people do see the changes, though. Sometimes the changes are big enough to get into awareness. And so in this study, we asked, well, what happens with this form of perceptual continuity when two discontinuities run into each other? And so you've got discontinuities on the top that are property changes. And there are other forms of discontinuity that can happen as just sort of that come from spatial displacements. And so many of you probably know this idea of the 180 rule is another form of discontinuity. And just to briefly let you know what it is, I'm sure most of you do know what it is. I have to make sure I'm going forward here. That's forward. The 180 violation, just a reminder, I'm sure many of you know about this, is basically a heuristic on where to place the camera when you're filming that ensures that each participant, each person that you're filming, each actor that you're filming, for example, when you film a conversation between people, stays on the correct side of the screen, usually, depending how and they're looking in the same direction, right? So if you obey the rule, as is the case up there on top, you have actor one in shot one there looking to the left, actor two looks to the right, actor one always looks to the left, and you keep that consistent. If you violate the rule, you go from actor one looking to the left, actor two looking to the right, and all of a sudden actor one back there is looking to the right again, and the experience is of a displacement, right? And there's some really interesting research just recently came out that actually did verify that for the first time. Alan Kingstone did, and his group did a great experiment that verified that, yeah, when you violate the 180 rule, people notice this, although it's a little unclear about how exactly they experience the violation, and violations can make it more difficult to organize the space. And that's old research by Robert Kraft from back in the day. So the question is, okay, what is the impact of two continuity errors at once? Okay, we made an experiment where we asked, would a 180 violation affect the degree to which you see a change on that very same shot? And so we made experiments in which we did some films. This was research by Louis Baker, in which we set up some reverse angles, and then we had a key shot in which there was a visual change. So this actress's shirt has changed from gray to red, or there was no change, and there was a violation error, or the change and violation happened together. And so the question is, will you get more change detection of this person's shirt when there's a violation versus when there's not a violation? Okay, so will a 180 violation increase change detection? Will it decrease change detection? Or will it have no effect? And let's go to our voting here. Okay, so this is empirical test number 2. You got to vote. 1, increase change detection. Will a 180 violation increase change detection? Will it decrease change detection? Or will it have no effect? Okay, so write down your vote. You got to write it down. You're going to have to trade with somebody. Okay, write down your vote. Empirical test 2, trade, make a new friend. And then we're going to vote. We're going to see what people say here. And we're going to find out the answer. Okay, here we go. Okay, so how many people have a vote for increased change detection? Raise your hand. Increased change detection. Okay, looks like about 40% decreased change detection. Okay, a substantial group say decreased change detection and no effect. Okay, the correct answer is increased change detection. Increased votes 1. You can pat yourselves on the back. We found out that if you just have the change, about 50% of people detected this change. And we created circumstances where change detection was like really high. We kind of warned people a little bit and we made a big change. But if the change co-occurred with a 180 violation, then change detection went up. And this is a pretty interesting phenomenon, I think, because there are a lot of contextual variables that affect it. What is going on here? Why does 180 violation increase change detection? Well, let's get some clues about why that might be happening. A couple of notes. One, this effect replicates with consistent backgrounds. It's not just the fact that a 180 violation changes the background. You get the same effect when you rotate the actor around, you cheat the actor around, you keep the background the same. That also increases change detection. Another thing we noticed was that you get more change detection in this circumstance with new events. So we created movies where the event changed versus the event stayed the same. In this case, it was a change in the topic of the actors' conversations. Change detection goes up there. We also noticed, or we observed, that 180 violations increase the perception of new events. So if you ask people to view a movie with and without a 180 violation, you ask them to segment the events and say when a new event starts, if there's a violation, they'll say, oh, that's a new event. And so what may be going on here is that these 180 violations are violations because we're psychologically attuned to detect spatial rearrangements of intentional agents in a scene and assume that means something new has happened. And when something new happens, a new event happens, then according to a lot of different theories, you compare properties. And I'd like to go in a little bit of detail on this property comparison process, because I think it's kind of interesting, because it tells us something else that we need to know about continuity, and that is we kind of need to understand a short-term memory system as well as attention. So if you look at what happened in these movies, you got an initial shot, and then another shot comes up, and imagine you're watching this movie, and your spotlight of attention hits that actress's shirt, right? So you pay attention to the shirt, and then you make a representation of that shirt in your brain. Right, so you attend, you make a representation. That sometimes happens, doesn't always happen. And then what happens is the next shot comes up. Okay, a key feature of this experiment is the shot intervening between the pre and post change property did not have that property in it. Okay, so these are basically their internal angles, so you can't see the other actor. Right, and so in this case, we've got, she's there and you can't see her shirt anymore. All you have is the representation in your memory of that property. It's gray stripes, that's why it looks like that. And then the next shot comes up, and the shirt appears again. If there's a 180 violation, we're arguing that that 180 violation increases change detection. The only way it can really increase change detection is by activating a comparison between what you're seeing now, that shirt, and what you had to have represented a few seconds ago. The average length of these shots is about 3 seconds. And so what we've got here is a situation where a 180 violation induced a comparison between what you're looking at now and what you've got in working memory. And so what this implies is that in order to understand even pretty perceptual, simple forms of continuity, you have to add this idea of working memory to attention. Because it really looks like you've got this situation where you're paying attention to properties and you've got this sort of provisional storage of properties that you may or may not compare until a new event comes up. And so you provisionally store properties, don't necessarily do a default comparison, and then there is some ongoing default spatial integration where you keep track of spatial consistency. And when that consistency breaks down a little bit, as in a 180 violation, you start to compare what you're seeing with what you remember in preparation for understanding a new event, basically. And I want to point out, again, we've got some great theories that are very closely related to continuity and about continuity that this is quite consistent with, right? So we've got event segmentation theory. Jeff Sachs has written a lot about this topic. Also the scene perception and event comprehension theory, which also has a lot to say about the degree to which, especially these sort of integrations involve inferences about narratives. And so this is consistent with that idea, and it really tells us we need attention. We also need to think about some sort of working memory to help us understand continuity. Okay, let's combine attention and working memory with the next thing I think we need to understand when we think about continuity, and that is how we integrate information in short-term memory using meaning. And so there's lots of ways this integration happens. In the interest of time, I'm going to go pretty quick through this one. We're not going to do a vote on this one. We'll get to the next one to vote. How do I, can you, I'll start. Yeah, can you do the start?
Lock code prefix.
So this is from the movie Dr. Strange.
Code prefix lock.
Kubrick.
Switch all receiver circuits to CRM discriminators.
All circuits switch to CRM discriminators.
Check all the destruct circuits.
All the destruct circuits checked.
And so what you notice in this scene is an interesting form of more meaningful integration happening now. And that is between language, what that guy is saying, and the actions that one of his, the member of his crew are engaging in. And so some real interesting now links that exist at a higher order than just perception. And the question is, how does the information in those links between what people say and what they do affect continuity? How does that work? We did some experiments on that by looking at instructional videos and by testing the effects of breaking that continuity. And so what we did was we created instructional videos that have language and actions in them. And so in this case, the language in these videos, and this is some research by Madison Lee, was published last year in JP General, found some really meaningful relationships that you would think would be integrated in a continuous scene. She found relationships between what people say and what they do. So for example, an instructor may say, I'm going to press sort, and then they hit the menu. And you can see that. So they said something, an action happens, and there's specific delays between the language and the actions, and they go in all sorts of different ways. So this is a form of information that is in these videos. And the question is, what does disrupting this form of information do? One thing you note about the information is that most of it is variability within about a second. Usually what people say when you understand what they've said and the action follows within a pretty darn short time period. And so do we use this information to integrate and understand? Well, we tested that by looking at the effects of disrupting the information. So all we did was we took those instructional videos, and they were both these screen captured videos where people do something on the screen. We also had live action videos too. And we moved the soundtrack forward or backwards. So some of the soundtracks were exactly when the authors made them. Some were forward a little bit so that they said things relatively early. Some were backward a little bit so they said things relatively late. We manipulated that by 0 seconds, by plus or minus 1 second, 3 seconds, 7 seconds, and so forth. And so the question is, how much manipulation Can your continuity system stand before it starts breaking down and before understanding becomes difficult? And so in this experiment, we did, like I said, screen capture videos, live action videos. For the live action videos, it's all like people's hands doing things while they narrated what they were doing. And so we had participants view a bunch of those videos, and they were tested after each for learning, awareness of the manipulation. Could they detect whether the soundtrack was off? Event segmentation, we had them segment the events. And we also asked cognitive load. Was it harder to understand these videos? Can you feel this in your brain as the sound gets more and more off? And so the question is, how much of this manipulation can you do before you start to suffer a cost? So you got to vote again here. Okay, so say 1 if you think it's really small, like 100 milliseconds. 2, 3, 4, 4 is 1,000 seconds. So if you think it's 4, well, that our plus and minus 1 second manipulation started to cause problems. 1,500, 3,000, 7,000 milliseconds, 7 seconds plus or minus for the soundtrack. Does that start interfering? Doesn't matter at all, ever. None of the above. Vote. Okay, you got to vote? So do 1 through 7, or 1 through 9, 1 through 9. And trade? Okay, vote and trade. Make sure you trade. You got to trade. That's part of the thing here, man. Okay, and get ready to represent the vote you have. Okay, how many people say, I'm going to group 1, 2, or 3 together? 1, 2, or 3? Okay, yeah, some people said 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so pretty short manipulation. 4,000 milliseconds. Okay, we got a few 4s. 5, 1,500. Does that start mattering? 6, 3,000 seconds, 3 whole seconds back and forth. Okay, it looks like we got about 2/3 of the people. 7,000 seconds. Okay, not until about 10% of people are saying 7,000 seconds. Doesn't matter at all ever. We got a few people already getting wise to the program here, right? That's not going to matter. That's what he does, right? To show stuff. None of the above. Anybody? Okay, so none of the above. Okay, here's the correct answer. The correct answer is 3 to 7 seconds. And then it starts mattering. Okay, so you can congratulate yourself on that. Here are the data. So what you find when you do this is that plus or minus 1 second does not affect anything we can measure. Once you get out to 3 seconds, then people can start detecting that something's amiss if they look, if they over and over again start scrutinizing. I bet if they didn't scrutinize 3 seconds, they wouldn't detect it. Okay, and you get by 7 seconds, then you start seeing some problems. You start seeing learning go down. In this case, one big one, task load goes up. It starts to become harder and harder to understand these videos. So what we've got here is an interesting situation where it looks like we've got a window in our brain that is pretty flexible, that can put together information no matter how or when it occurs. Okay. Another little, I'm going to skip the next thing so I go to some even more meaningful integrations. So if you've got this window that's kind of flexible, where it doesn't really matter when stuff happens, it's not until you start really attaching those events to a meaningful framework. Well, how does that work? Does this meaningful framework, is that the thing that starts organizing and producing cognitive continuity? And that meaningful framework can come from a lot of places. One of them is this thing called theory of mind, which is this collection of cognitive skills that help people understand the behavior of agents as driven by beliefs, desires, and goals. So is it the beliefs, desires, and goals of your actors that start to organize this previously relatively disorganized set of properties and actions? And so theory of mind is a good candidate for this because it underlies pretty much all social interaction. We learn it as little kids. And it's what drives our inferences and predictions about behavior. And a number of people have talked about that, including Cataline Balin, Cynthia Cabañas, and we had an article about that in Cinema back in the day. And I'm going to skip one experiment because this one is not associated with particular surprise. And we looked at how theory of mind organizes not only your understanding of scenes and integrations of shots, but also helps you think deeply about how those organized moments turn into deep inferences about the movie, and how those organized moments can be attached to what you know and can be the source of subsequent deep thinking or reflection. And so our idea here was that theory of mind, as measured by some individual difference tests that we gave our participants. We gave them the faux pas task, which is reading the mind, the reading the mind in the eyes task, which you have to say what the emotion is in the eyes, harder than you might think. And there's the false belief stories task, where you read little stories and people have to figure out how the false beliefs work, and faux pas detection, detecting when someone said something offensive. Someone's overridden someone else's belief, desires, and goals. So these are individual difference tests. And we wanted to know the degree to which people who are good at these theory of mind tests are better at integrating scenes and therefore reflect about movies more and also understand the moral in movies more. So we're trying to make a connection between experience, continuity, and then reflection, deep understanding, and moral understanding, using these skills that you would think would underlie both integration and moral understanding. Understanding someone else's perspective you would think would be important for moral understanding. Okay, and so the question is, if you do an experiment in which people have their theory of mind skills measured, and then they watch a movie, and you assess the degree to which they reflect on that movie. Did they think about it afterwards? And you assess their moral understanding. You have them write a little essay and you rate how good the essay was, basically. How does theory of mind affect reflection? Does it make you reflect more? Does it make you have better moral understanding? And so the question, and here's the experiment we did. We did a couple different experiments. We assessed movies that people had watched outside of our experiment. We asked them, did you see this movie? How much did you reflect on the movie? And then we gave them the theory of mind test. We also showed them a specific movie. This is by Karen Perlman, a really great short film called After Saturn. One of our SCSMI members did great stuff, and she's working with us on this problem, on this experiment. We have them then, when they watch the movie, report their reflection after a week. How much did they think about the movie? And then they do the essay, and we get all the individual difference measures. And so here's the question. Individuals with strong theory of mind skills will do what? Will they reflect more? So that's that link between theory of mind skills and reflection. Is that going to be a positive link? If you have more theory of mind skills, do you reflect more? That's number one. Have better moral understanding. So that's link number two there. That's that direct link from theory of mind skills to moral understanding. Will they both reflect and have better moral understanding? Or maybe theory of mind predicts nothing, or none of the above. Vote. Which one of these is going to happen in the experiment? Okay, take it. You got to commit, and now share your vote with somebody. Pass it around. Again, we're going to be raising hands based on somebody else's vote here. Pass your vote around. And you're going to get the answer here. And one thing here is you can vote for multiple, because multiple could be true, right? You could vote for more than one. I hope nobody's disappointed that they didn't get to vote for more than one. But here is the result. It's a big old none of the above. This experiment came as a total surprise to us. We were not expecting this. Here's what happened. This is a path model showing all the variables in the experiment. I'm going to focus you in on just a couple of links. So what we're looking at here is the link between individual differences in theory of mind and reflection, how much they thought as measured by the RII. It's a scale of reflection. How much do you think about the movie? And that's the link between theory of mind and that. This is the link between theory of mind and moral understanding ratings. So that's the direct effect there. This is the effect from RII to moral understanding ratings. What you will notice is a negative coefficient on that link between theory of mind and reflection, and a positive coefficient to moral understanding. What this means is that people with good theory of mind skills tended to reflect on the movies less than people with bad theory of mind skills. But people with good theory of mind skills wrote more sophisticated essays. what is going on here? And I will point out that I wouldn't be telling you about this. I didn't believe it the first time unless we'd replicated this. We observed this 3 times now in 3 different experiments. We're doing a new experiment where we do EEG on everyone. We'll get a 4th replication hopefully soon. This happens. And so the question is, why is this happening? I'm almost out of time. So what I want to do is end with a hypothesis that maybe can generate some discussion about why this surprise happened. And this is one of the points I want to make here, is that I love surprises because they are the thing that means it was worthwhile to run the experiment. Your ideas were wrong. You got surprised by the data, which makes that data all that much more worth collecting. So what's going on here? I want to sort of start our discussion about what could be going on here with a movie from, I'm going to skip all my big ideas. So these are just abstruse ideas here. We can skip them. That came to us. I'm going to go back so that I can give some credit here. This is a sequence from the movie Leave Her to Heaven. I got this sequence by reading Todd Berliner's book, Hollywood Aesthetic, Pleasure in American Cinema. He presented this sequence because it shows some of the ways in which Hollywood filmmakers sort of tend to defy our expectations about film genre and create sometimes forms of engagement that I'm going to call rough engagement, to borrow an idea from another person, Carl Plantinga, that should be in his book. I think he's kind of iffy on whether he's going to include the book. I think he should include this idea of rough engagement, because I think that's what's going on, and I think there may be some ways in which rough engagement can be a clue for what's going on with our theory of mind skill. So watch this sequence, and let's see how it relates to basically all the things I talked about before. Okay, I'm going to go back. Can I do the forward thing and play the sequence? Okay, go back. Okay, here we go.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
What is the theory of mind going on inside this person's head? There's something, I think, a little rough and strange about this that gives us some hints, I think, about why it is that we got these strange, surprising results. And maybe I'll just leave you with that, in part because I'm totally out of time in going over the question and answer period. But as I do with my students, you got to answer this question. I'm not going to give you the answer. Maybe discuss among yourselves. If you've got questions, we can start thinking about this sequence. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And also thanks to the funders.
Tim, I see first. If I don't fall.
Okay, thanks, Cole. Great, as always, Dan. Very provocative. I'm going to focus on something you probably don't expect me to, but in your path diagram, one of the biggest effects you had came from sex. I want to know which way you coded male and female. Is it the way I'd expect it to be, given the...
I don't want female to
Okay.
the negative relationships were... Sex did not come out in any of the path models. Sex did not come out as significant in any of the path models except for this one.
Okay.
So it's a little exceptional. But if you go back, there's the result. So this is a reflection on the movie After Saturn. So this is the one where they watched After Saturn. And basically, we found that females just tended not to reflect on After Saturn as much. This does not hold true for the other movies. So I think our hypothesis is they didn't reflect on it, and they didn't like it that much.
They didn't like it.
Men like this movie more.
Have you reported this finding to Karen? See what she says.
What's that?
Have you reported
No,
it
we
to
have
Karen?
actually not told Karen about this one. She has not seen this. We are actually going to be doing some interactions with her where she really sort of works through some of the responses, and her son as well, Sam, the filmmakers, work through some of these responses and use them to think about maybe ways that their creative process could be informed by this kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this talk. I want to ask, why did you need the study of the scene integration part? Because you thought that the ways of scene integration, so the low-level scene integration differences will influence how the integrated scene will be interpreted?
I think those processes in the model that I kind of skipped through are in many ways independent unless you have a really clear functional goal for interrogating those core processes, right? And so if you really want to sort of think about deeply, oh, why is this person looking at this other person? And why is this action happening the way it is? If you've got a really sort of strong goal, then those processes will sort of matter more. But if you don't, they'll kind of happen at this kind of default way, at this very minimalistic form of matching or this minimalistic level of matching until you have a really strong goal and often strong support. So if you want viewers to really sort of think about connections between the meaning of a scene and the specific actions in the scene, the specific moments, the specific movements, that's the place I think where the interesting art comes in, because you really got to provide those rhythms, which is what Karen Perlman would talk about, those cues, the composition. That's where you start nudging people to make those connections between those core perceptual properties and the deep meaning. Otherwise, I think this research suggests might not happen without that support. So that would be kind of one of the points.
So you wanted to make the argument that even very low-level scene integration processes are influenced by top-down processes.
Yes, and they can be, especially with a lot of support.
Yeah.
But aren't by default.
Thanks.
We have a question over here in the back.
I hope it's okay to ask about the first experiment that you were talked about rather than continuing, but if there's someone else, I'll leave time. The one that had to do with the match action shots and having exact graphic overlap. I was wondering if, well, maybe we'll look at it later. You showed within all of the conditions that had the graphic overlap, if there was a preference for the timing, and there wasn't. But it seems like it's also worthwhile to look at, in relative terms, whether all of those were bad relative to when there wasn't graphic overlap. And the reason I ask for that is, in terms of this delay of 2 or 3 frames, that goes back to like Richard Anderson, Joseph Anderson talks about that in Reality of Illusion, talking about masking. James Cutting talks about it in 2025 in his chapter in Richard Anderson's book. In that one, it's about meta-contrast masking, which is really low level, and talking about you really need that 2 or 3 frames. And funny enough, in the same chapter, Cutting talks about beta motion, where if you were to have the exact same location for a given object before and after the cut, you could have this unattractive sort of apparent motion happen. And if that's happening in all cases, then it might not matter at all whether you have a lap or overlap, not have an overlap. That condition is just going to always have beta motion. So I'm wondering if you did a comparison across the graphic overlap condition versus the non-graphic one to see whether just that they're all bad because they have beta motion.
Yeah, good point. So a couple of comments. One is that there were no floor ceiling effects in the ratings. So it's not like all the ratings were super low and therefore showed no differences. They're all really kind of in the middle. People thought that the shots were sort of reasonably smooth in all cases. And then you start talking about this interesting question of the apparent motion or the beta motion or whatever it's called. It's the long-range apparent motion, that might induce different amounts of preference for an overlap or an ellipsis. And those were kind of partly what we were thinking about a little bit, because those depend the most on graphic matches, on screen location matches. Right, if you have a really tight screen location match versus one that maybe it looks like it jumped up a little bit. And so we thought, yeah, maybe there was some way in which the graphic match caused some apparent motion. One of the issues with the apparent motion in an effectively edited motion picture, that small difference in apparent motion is likely flooded out by the apparent motion that causes sort of occurring throughout the whole scene. Right, and so that's kind of maybe why you have the 30-degree rule, right? Because you want to have a lot of apparent motion just kind of evenly across the field so no one thing stands out. If you have a situation where you really don't move the camera much and just that one thing changes, then the apparent motion will start to matter more. And we tried to avoid that. And if you have a shot, sequence where you really don't change camera angles, you'll start to get the beta motion mattering a lot more. So that's my guess, is that in this case, it's pretty subtle.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much for your talk. I really like the idea of you're trying to connect this very hard thing between like low-level processes and the very highest end moral understanding. First, before I give you what could be my hypothesis of what's going on, I wanted to know yours, because I think you didn't really tell us. So, yeah, what do you think is going on?
Here's my guess, and we've been talking about this for the last year now, trying to figure out what's going on. People who have effective theory of mind tend to encapsulate these continuity moments and not think about them again, right? So it's a question of encapsulation. It's this understanding of a short-term event in your cognitive temporal window. And if you're good with theory of mind, it's like, it goes together, I get it, no conflict, I don't really need to return and reflect on it very much. And then when it comes time for them to write the moral essays, they haven't really thought about the movie that much, but they can regenerate a new good essay because they have a good understanding of belief, desires, goals, and it is actually associated with language and general intelligences as well. So they're reproducing the essays. That's why you have a positive relationship between theory of mind and the quality of the moral essay, but maybe a negative relationship with reflection. So one of the ideas here is that, well, for those folks, you need that rough engagement, right? You need to start breaking the basic sort of events that organize continuity to get them to think, because otherwise it's like they'll think, they'll forget it, they'll encapsulate it. It's like reading a sentence, right? You read the sentence, if you're good at integrating the phrase structure, the sentence structure goes. All you remember really is the gist, right? You don't really interrogate it. So that's my hypothesis, and I think that's why this movie, Leave Her to Heaven, is kind of interesting in that case. Maybe if we showed them that movie, the folks with good theory of mind would have the positive relationship.
Yeah, that goes very much in line a little bit into what I was thinking, the idea that those that have high theory of mind would already have solved whatever riddle in the theory of mind. But I also like, and this idea that then later when you ask them to do the essays, they're very capable of doing it better.
Yeah.
Takes me to this differentiation that we did in my studies with Tim, but also like we took also from Kathleen Balint's studies, the differentiation between like sort of the ability and the tendency. So what we like discuss as spontaneous theory of mind, and this idea that, some people just tend to do that. So I think that's also something to take into consideration. But also, as you say, the type of film, whether it's more artsy and it does allow a big space for people to, put in. Be really happy to read this and see the differences between films and individual differences. Thank you.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, especially the relationship between theory of mind ability and tendency. They might have these interesting sort of converse, if you're really good at it, it's like, do it.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have that much need for cognition, so you don't really do it that much, but you can.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, please join me in thanking Dan for his presentation.